One of the big problems with generative AI is that the framing from the very beginning has been smoke and mirrors. And this is really the problem with some of the benefits of the new technology is that on one hand, there are some really interesting things you can do with coding assistance. For example, you can build a new test file or build a new class or maybe convert something from Bash that has a really good interface to it to TypeScript, something I do quite a bit actually, or convert something from Python to a more performant language like Rust. These are all really interesting things you can do, but the problem with our current hype phase is that a lot of it is smoke and mirrors based on the reframing. And I think the best place to start this podcast is to say, if you look at the Wizard of Oz, I think that's probably one of the best paradigms to view where we're at in 2025, where you see, I'm the great and powerful Wizard of Oz, right? And on one hand, the Wizard of Oz does have some things that he's good at. For example, he does have a castle and he does have like hot air balloons and he does have the ability to, have power over people, etc. So like there's some real components of, you know, power and resources that the Wizard of Oz has, but the fact that he's claiming he has magical powers is really at the heart of why when the little dog pulls back the curtain and then Dorothy has her intuition around, hey, something's going on here that doesn't make sense, then you can see that in fact the entire thing was smoke and mirrors. And in fact, literally in the Wizard of Oz are smoke and mirrors. I think similarly with this idea that the word AI means anything close to what we have currently is completely ridiculous. And in fact, one of the problems is that in the Bay Area, in Mountain View, Palo Alto, Atherton, all places I've hung out in my life, you have people who want to sell the product vision versus the actual product. And the reason for this is that there is a very profitable pipeline from the Bay Area into creating things that look like they work and then collapse once they've been able to walk away. And we see this with some of the true frauds like, Theranos and FTX and all of the or FX, like these crypto companies. Really what happens with those kinds of technologies is that it looks like it works, they get some money and then they walk away. And it has maybe a lot more in common with Enron than it does with AI. So that's really the framing of how I wanted to start this podcast. And then now let's get into the history of some of the technologies and talk about how we could reframe the entire conversation with a more pessimistic but realistic way to look at what these generative search and generative auto-completion and generative pattern matching tools will actually do. So to start with, if we look at the simple algorithms and you look at complex statistical models, they look like magic because they do really interesting things. So for example, we know that some of the pattern recognition tools have been around since the 1950s, and K-means clustering was around kind of a similar period of time. And K-means clustering is amazing, right? Because you can look at something in multidimensional space and create a cluster and say, hey, what is this cluster? For example, if it's baseball players, if you cluster around the multiple dimensions, you say height and weight and position, you can start to like infer like, hey, look at this. This is a catcher, this is a pitcher, or, this is the outfielder, right? So you can find some interesting things, but it doesn't mean that that interesting thing is intelligence. Also, if we look at statistical language models, they've been around for the last, several decades. And the idea here is that you're going to introduce the next word prediction. We look at search engines. Google, when it came out, was really successful because it was able to give you useful information. And if we look at things like maybe like transcribing your audio into text, like these are all really interesting things, or auto-completion with Microsoft Intelligence. These individual components, when they're put together, are orchestrated in a way that make them seem more powerful than they actually are. But what's actually new? I think that's really the interesting thing to look at in terms of the AI technologies. Well, they use more data, more compute. So does that make it better? And then if we also look at the architectural improvements. We have the ability to, build on the same foundations that we've had before. We're also seeing the integration of techniques. So maybe like a language model was one, a recommendation engine, a pattern recognition. So really it's the recombination, just like we've seen with the steam engine that went to the internal combustion engine, that went to the EV vehicles, right? We see all these different recombination of ideas that are found with traditional innovation pipelines. And this has happened throughout history with music, with engineering, with lots of different things. It's that recombination of ideas that can make this incremental progress. But the incremental progress is not exponential growth, which is what's been claimed with these AI technologies. We also see the accessibility, right? You can do voice or you can do text, but if you break each piece separately, you can see each piece is knowable, but when they look at the whole system together, it seems magical, just again like the Wizard of Oz. So at the core, though, it's all just the same. It's a statistical pattern matching system. And so this is not intelligence. This is just a statistical pattern matching system. If we look at the word artificial intelligence, unfortunately, it's such a terrible word because it makes it seem like it does more than it does. And there's lots of critics. People have called it stochastic parrot by Emily Bender, or statistical pattern matcher, Gary Marcus, next token predictor, neural text synthesizer, all these different kinds of people who are rightfully looking at the systems and saying, why are we calling it AI? They're actually spot on, because there is no component that is an intelligent component. It's like saying linear regression is intelligence. It's useful, but it's not intelligent. At the heart of intelligence is consciousness. And if you look at the biological origins of consciousness, the whole point of consciousness is you can be aware of the situation you're in and make decisions. These statistical pattern matching systems are not aware of the situation they're in. And that's why a self-driving car or a coding assistant are tantalizingly interesting, except for when they get into a component that creates a edge case, and that edge case can be fatal. So if we look at some of the catastrophic things that can happen with AI, we know that, for example, AI generated code could recommend packages that don't exist. They could recommend security vulnerabilities. Maybe people are writing code that is bad, or maybe the data sets have been poisoned that they're training on that have vulnerabilities. So these can create supply chain attacks and also security vulnerabilities. So think about this for a second. Just that alone doesn't pass the smell test. How could you possibly be intelligent but be recommending libraries in software that don't exist? Or how could you possibly be intelligent and telling people to create security vulnerabilities unless you're evil, right? Why would it make sense? That's why the word AI is such a bad word. Instead, maybe it's generative autocompletion, or generative search, or generative pattern matching, right? Once you take out the word intelligence, then things start to make a lot more sense. Likewise, legal advice, people are using it where there's completely fabricated court cases, or if you question like a chatbot because they're using this kind of ELIZA effect of this kind of fake intelligence, they'll double down and say, oh no, I really do know what I'm talking about. We also know that a lot of the research shows that there's a lot of hallucination that occurs with these tools. And so if you're treating it and you're anthropomorphizing this and treating it like it's a human, you're going to get deeply fooled. And if we look at some of the life or death consequences, medical could be one, like radiology. Why would you want to defer to AI if in fact you need to do a lot of critical thinking based on some pattern that it recognized? Because again, it doesn't have intelligence. We look at research, why would I trust all of the research? You could think of it as, I found a pattern and I need to validate what it said. Or a doctor being lazy and saying, look, yeah, here's the root cause, but you need to go follow up on it yourself, just like you would do with a scatter plot. You don't just give someone a scatter plot and say, yep, this thing is smart. It told you that here's all the points on it on a plane. what does that even mean? You have to actually interpret it as the expert. And we look at some of the downsides as well with some of the tools. We've seen these fake kind of, hey, everything's going to be solved by algorithms and by AI, like Zillow, for example, tried to auto buy houses, had huge losses, laid off people. So we see that this kind of catastrophic failure is built into believing that the system is more powerful than it is, the Wizard of Oz kind of scenario. We see that there's also lots of examples of things like the SEC, looking at companies that have been falsely claiming to use AI. We look at startups that claim to use AI, they don't use AI. We also see that there's financial incentives. Again, you want to create the appearance of something that works, so you call it AI when it's just essentially like a search tool. And this is really leading to this Wizard of Oz effect. For example, Amazon walkout technology relied on 1,000 workers in India. We have Scale AI that claims they can do all this automatic data labeling, but it turns out that they're using low-paid human data. Some of these AI-driven services are actually using humans behind the scenes, like old school Mechanical Turk, the stories of the fake chess playing robot. And these companies deliberately use misleading terminology like intelligence and cognitive skills to mislead people, like saying, hey, I can build a chatbot that's smarter than a PhD. It doesn't even compute. It's like saying K-means clustering is smarter than a PhD. What does that even mean? It can find a pattern that even the smartest people on earth can't find. Great. I think that's a good point. But the consciousness is the key here. Is like, if you don't even know if that pattern should be evaluated to act upon, or whether you should just walk away, that means nothing. Finding a pattern is not intelligence. So likewise, if you get into the thinking about this things from a productivity standpoint, the best way to think about this is to reframe it as just yet another IT technology like cloud computing, etc. And so how would you actually implement this? Well, one, get the word AI out. And if you think about DevOps, for example, all DevOps is a copy of the Toyota Way, which was a great way to think about making low defect automobiles, but you do it with software. And they have things with Toyota Way like, for example, Go and See, or continuous improvement, or for example, human in the loop, right? These are all kinds of really good technology systems that DevOps has borrowed from. Likewise, when we have a new technology like this generative search or generative code completion, we should be building on top of what was already in play. For example, deterministic techniques like build servers, change logs, source control, automated testing. This is really where we're going to get the value versus trying to claim that it's automatically intelligent. So if you look at some of the historical problems with hype cycles, we see the dot-com bubble was a good example. 95 to 2002, you added dot-com, you increased the valuation, but the end result was close to 80% market value decline. Trillions of value get wiped away. Likewise, we have blockchain and hyper cryptocurrency here. So all this hype around Web3, decentralized, all this stuff. Again, Bitcoin loses 80% of its value. We look at big data like Hadoop. It was interesting, but a lot of it didn't pan out. Virtual reality, I have a lot of experience with virtual reality. Worked in one of the first virtual reality companies, Second Life. It was supposed to do all this stuff, replace education. Turns out did nothing. Internet of Things, same thing, lots of hype, but turns out people don't want the fridge to talk to the internet. Cloud computing, something I definitely believe in, but it was supposed to get rid of all this IT work, but it just changed it. So if we look at these other hype cycles, there's no doubt in 2026, this is probably when it's going to all play out, is that people are going to go, A, it's not AI, B, it's useful, but C, in order for us to use it, we're going to have to completely change how we think about it and look at the pre-existing successful techniques of how we use technology and apply those. So really, to wrap things up here, the practical way to implement these solutions is to reframe it. And the word AI is a terrible word, unfortunately. And you should be thinking about it more of like it's a different kind of database, or it's a different kind of search engine, or it's a different kind of IT technology. Once you reframe it that way, then you realize like, yeah, this is useful. I should be using this, but I should also not be in any way thinking there's any form of intelligence with this technology, because if I do, what I'm going to do is I'm going to completely destroy my own personal credibility. I'm going to destroy my company, and we're not going to be successful in what we do. And that's really the trick with the IT technology, the software industry, is to look for incremental improvements, do continuous improvements, refine things based on a business problem you're actually solving versus just believing some kind of a hype engine. And what could happen as well is that if we get into a deep recession in 2026, the way forward will be to outcompete people by thinking the technology is less powerful. And if you really kind of get surprised if a technology can do something more than you expected, then that's a better approach to competing, I believe, in 2026. So in a nutshell, these tools are not AI. The best approach to using them is to be skeptical. And then finally, if you're able to think about your competition, you're going to be able to outcompete people who are believing this magical thinking around generative AI tools, and you can really seriously, lead by example by thinking more realistically about these tools.